Hey, welcome to Totally Rad Guitars. My last video about the Mesa Mark IV was pretty well received. I'm really just glad anybody watched it, really. I just like to talk about amps and stuff, so the response I got there was very cool. So I thought I would cover another iconic amplifier, rolling back to Marshall, kind of the start of distorted rock guitar. Now, opening the can of worms that is talking about Marshall amps, it's kind of a huge subject, so I thought I would start with probably the earliest circuit that I have access to, at least. In this case, the 1987 model plexi. Now, this amp is a reissue made in 2003, so it has an effects loop that normally would not be on traditional plexis. This also is not anywhere close to the first Marshall, so a little history for context on that. Jim Marshall started his shop in 1960. Originally, he was a drummer, and they sold guitars, drums, basses, and amps from other makers like Vox and Fender. And Gibson and Supro and all those kind of old school amp designs. And, based in London, he had a lot of pretty high profile rock acts coming through, like Eric Clapton and Pete Townshend and other bands like that, and guitar players like that. And the push was to create an amp that had more volume than other amps available at the time. Back then, probably one of the most iconic amps, and still is now, is the Fender Bassman, the Tweed version. Now, that normally was originally designed to be a bass player's amp, because low frequencies are harder to hear, generally speaking, when you're playing in like a loud environment. So that amp was really geared more towards bass players, but it ended up being a really popular guitar player platform because more and more people were going to concerts, and the bands needed more volume so that they could be heard over the crowd. At the time, the Fender Bassman was 45 watts, running off of two 6L6 tubes. So Jim Marshall and some staff that he'd hired, forgive me for forgetting all their names, but they began to work on higher output amplifier. So sometime in early 1960 and released in 1962 was the first Marshall, the JTM 45. And that was similar to the circuit idea of a Bassman, but with a few key changes like increased negative feedback and increased output. Even though it carried the same rating of 45 watts, it was a louder amp in the room. And part of that was that the amp broke up more, it overdrived more. Now, at the time, overdriving the amp wasn't really seen as all that pleasing of a sound. In this era, mainly amplifiers were used to replicate clean tones. And that style of overdriven tube sound was kind of new to the music scene. Overdriving speakers was more common back then, but obviously that's not exactly the most pleasing sound either, although was used to some effect on certain songs. For example, You Really Got Me by the Kinks. That is a lot of speaker distortion if you want to hear what that sounds like. So once the JTM 45 came out, it really hit the scene with some fanfare, but kind of some early adopters put it to good use, but it didn't, fly off the shelves right off the bat. Over time, they tweaked and added to that design, culminating in there was a JTM 50 and a JTM 45/100, which was a 100-watt version based on KT66 power tubes. The first plexi amplifiers, as we think of today, were the 1987 and 1959 models. Now, those are just model numbers. They don't have anything to do with the year that the amp came out. In this case, the 1987, like the one I have here, is the 50-watt model, and it had two EL34 power tubes. Now, due to the limitations of the environment I'm recording in here, I'm not going to be able to turn this amplifier up to maximum volume and really show you what power tube distortion can do. And the power tube distortion component was a big part of what made these amps so popular and what made their sound so interesting. So this amp, it's 50 watts, 2 EL34s, 3 12AX7 tubes. But what's interesting about this amp compared to later Marshalls, which I'll get into in some future videos, but this amp has 2 channels, but they're not channels like you would think of in a modern sense, where you can switch between them like a clean channel and a distortion channel or something like that. Instead, you just have 2 identical channels with basically the same circuit, but a few tweaks that change the voicing of them. So you have a normal channel and a high treble channel, and the normal channel is pretty deep and bassy, and the high treble channel is a lot brighter. And you could use whichever channel you wanted for your style of music. Of course, what makes them interesting is that you can jumper these channels and play both channels together in parallel. And that's a lot different than a cascading gain stage like if the amp were in series. For example, the later JMP and then JCM 800 models like the 2203 and 2204, those are cascaded gain stage preamp designs. So it's a little bit different than the plexi, and that's kind of what gives the plexi its unique tones. Now mine has been modified with this master volume control, which I put right here on the front panel, replacing the low input for the normal channel. So just to show what the controls are like, over here at the input section, you have 2 inputs labeled 1 and 2 inputs labeled 2 normally. And the top inputs are the full volume inputs. And that's what you would use the vast majority of the time, especially if you're going for an overdriven kind of sound. The lower inputs, there's a resistor in between, but it lowers the volume by 6 decibels. Going into the front of the amplifier. So that reduces some of the gain and overdrive you can get out of the amp. Now I took out the low input for channel 2 and I put this volume control here. Now older plexis, the volume control, adding a master volume to an older plexi was a little bit more involved. In this case, I just strapped this pot with 2 wires straight across the effects loop. Super simple, super easy. It is a phase inverter master volume. So we're not going to get any kind of phase inverter or power tube distortion here, or at least barely any at the volumes that I'm going to be able to record at. And that's just a limitation of where I live. Obviously, in a perfect world, I'd be able to crank this thing up as loud as possible, put in some earplugs maybe, because it is, even with this master volume control added here, it is deafeningly loud. It's very easy to make this amp a lot louder than 50 watts would seem to indicate. So those are the inputs you have there. So if I plug into the high 2, then I'm only using this normal loudness. It's called loudness on this amp, but it's your volume control. So only the normal control affects my volume while I'm in input 2. Now if I plug into input 1, then it's switched around and the high treble loudness control then becomes my volume control. Now since I have a master volume here, I can crank these up pretty high and keep the master volume down a little bit, and it's going to allow me to kind of show what the preamp is capable of as far as overdrive goes. These amps are pretty regarded for being relatively clean, although you can get them pretty gritty and chunky, especially with power tube distortion, but barring that with a master volume control like I've installed on mine. And then it has the standard, for this time, you've got treble, middle, bass, and presence, which is probably more EQing than most amps back then that just had treble and bass controls, but pretty simple by today's standards. And then another cool tidbit about mine is this volume control I have wired up so that when I pull it out, it engages what's called the one-wire mod. And all that does is instead of, and here's where I'll go through the circuit a little bit, instead of having two separate channels in parallel, it's going to cascade one channel into the other, kind of like the 2204 or 2203 circuit design. But obviously, those amps, the values used in the circuit are specifically designed for a pleasing overdriven rock sound. So it's voiced a little bit better for what you might think of when you think of like an overdriven Marshall sound. In this case, when I pull that out, it's very, very loose on the bottom end, especially because the normal channel is, voiced so deep, and it's not tight at all. No bass is cut on that channel. So it's not really like high gain in a modern sense, but you'd be surprised just how high gain this amp can get with essentially one wire. In my case, a couple of extra for the master volume, but and I'll show that off kind of at the end of the video. Now, now to discuss the circuit a little bit, I'll put the circuit diagram up again. On this amp, you have, since there's two inputs, when you plug your guitar in, if you plug into, say, the normal channel, you go into the V1, your input gain tube stage. Then there's a second gain stage, which is V2A, and then V2B is the cathode follower and tone stack driver. As opposed to the Mesa, like I talked about before, you've got the tone stack is at the end of all the distortion. So the signal is going through all the distortion, all the preamp, and then you're changing the voicing of it at the end with the EQ, as opposed to it affecting at the beginning. So how much treble you dial in or whatever doesn't really affect how much gain the amp has. That stays the same based on your volume controls. Now, if you're plugged into the high treble channel, you go into V1B, and then V2A, and then so on. So each channel has two gain stages, which is not very many, especially by modern standards. A lot of modern Marshalls actually have 5 gain stages. So you can see that it's not really designed to be that high gain of an amp. So since you've got two channels, each with only 2 gain stages, if you use a small cable like this one, jumper cable, you can bridge the 2 channels, and then when you're plugged in, you're essentially sending a signal through both channels together at the same time in parallel. So it's a really, really unique sound, not something that's easily replicated because the circuit kind of has to be designed specifically to have 2 separate signals. And that's why a lot of times you'll see like plexi clones and the like will have a switch, like an automatic channel jumper, so you don't have to have the cable. But a lot of, it's kind of a big kind of marketing ploy, especially with boutique makers, to say that it has a plexi channel, or the rhythm channel sounds like a plexi or whatever like that. But really, you have to make some kind of compromise because, as you'll hear, the normal channel is too deep for its own. I think it sounds great, but it's certainly dark. And then the high treble channel is very, very bright. And a lot of people actually clip the bright cap off of the high treble channel, or they reduce its value to try to make it to tame the brightness and shrillness of that channel. Now this is totally stock other than the volume control. So that high treble channel is going to be very, very bright. And I left it like that on purpose because this is kind of my benchmark for plexi tones. With all the good things and flaws at the same time. Now, if I had 2 of these, I probably would tweak the other one a bit more and try to change its voicing a little bit more to my liking. Not that you can't get great tones out of this stock one, but it's really more of a platform, and that's another reason why this amp has endured so long and so well. This amp has been in continuous production since 1968, basically. It's been reissued and continued to be made, and the reissues now have an effects loop, but it's still mostly the same. They still make it today. It's still a very popular seller. And part of that also is, especially on the treble channel, because the brightness makes it sound really, really clear, is it's a great platform not only for modding in the circuit, but it's also a great platform for pedals. So this amp sounds really, really awesome boosted by, say, Boss SD1 or Ibanez Tube Screener or Klon Centaur or Proco Rat, anything like that, full tone OCD. I have a couple of those pedals here on the ground, so I'll flip some on and you know, kind of show what that sounds like. But what's cool about it is, you know, I have lots of amps here, and some amps, you know, I can put a couple of different pedals through it, and they don't really, it's not really transparent. It doesn't really show exactly what the pedal sounds like. Whereas this amp is very, very clear. Each pedal has its own character through this amp, and that's part of why they're so popular for touring and such, because even without a master volume, you could keep the volume pretty low on your preferred, whatever channel you prefer, for a good clean sound, and then do all of your dirt through pedals. And that's a pretty popular way to play, and you can get some really great sounds that way because the amp just lets you do so much as a platform to base your tone off of. And that's not even getting into, you know, tweaking the circuit. And the circuit is really, really simple because it's such an old design. I wouldn't say that I'm the most technically apt. I think I'm okay. But even I can look in there and pretty much tell what's going on because it's so simple, the layout. So I'll get into demonstrating kind of the different sounds. I'll try my best. I actually ran an attempt at recording this before and clipped the mic a lot, so I'll try to avoid doing that. So I'll have to check over there a couple times and just make sure that that's not happening. So in this video I'm playing, this is a 1982 Kramer Pacer. I love this guitar. It's got this really, really sweet glossy neck. And these Schaller Golden 50 humbuckers, they measure about 8K, but they're surprisingly high output for that low resistance rating. So they sound really great, but it's a great kind of guitar for this sort of like thick, maybe 70s, 80s kind of rock tone that this amp is known for. So I'll do my best to, hopefully my playing is okay. So right now I'm on the, I'll put it on the middle pickup. And I'm plugged into the normal channel, and I'm just going to set the volume right around 4, which is going to be pretty clean. So that sounds pretty great to me. It's very full. It really, really fills the room. I mean, my floors are shaking, and it's just very deep, beautiful sound. And it'd be good. It'd be just as good for maybe like some jazz. Yeah, so it's really good. Switching down to the bridge pickup, you can get a little more brightness out of it. But not much, because that channel is not really designed to be a really bright and snappy channel. Now for that, I'll switch back to the middle pickup here. And I'm going to turn the volume completely off on the normal channel. Remember, it doesn't matter if I'm plugged into the high treble channel. And I'll roll the high treble channel up to the same 4 on the volume here, and you can hear just a bit how much more snappy that is. Yeah, so it's a little bit louder as well at the same setting, and part of that's because the human ear perceives volume higher, usually around 3 kilohertz. So if you ever look at the curve of like human hearing, bass frequencies are not heard as loudly as higher frequencies, even though physically in the room it's the same volume. So that's what you're hearing there. I'm going to roll that off, go back to channel, the normal channel here, and I'm going to roll the volume all the way up and make sure that I don't clip my mic on the bridge pickup. Okay, so now you can hear what the normal channel sounds like at absolute full tilt. Now granted, this is without any power amp distortion, but just showing how much gain you can get out of the preamp here. So that sounds really, really good. Again, I'm pretty partial to the normal channel. I think it sounds really great on its own, but I like those darker tones. I think, you know, it's very smooth. Now, if I switch over, now we're just going to do the same thing. I'll switch over to the high treble channel. The volume on normal is off, not that it matters, and the high treble channel is maxed out. All right, so now you can hear this channel at full tilt as well. Right, so that one's got a lot more gain. You can definitely do a bit more. That's really in the classic rock kind of low gain, mid gain territory. You could definitely use that to play, you know, plenty of songs from that era. Cool. So that sounds pretty good. Now, part of the reason why I put this volume control here on input 2 is so I could still use both speaker jacks in the back. Not that I intend on doing too much of that, but because of that, I didn't break the ability to jumper the channels. So that's the next thing I kind of want to show here, is if I put this channel jumper in there so that channels 1 and 2 are jumpered together, and then plug into that available input. Now, both channels are running in parallel, and the amount of either channel can be dialed to sort of change the tone without ever even needing to touch the EQ section. In fact, I'm not going to touch the EQ section this entire video. Now, if I set them both to 4, that's kind of a good starting place, and I'll just show if you roll them both up. So I'll take them both all the way to 10. What you're going to hear is that the normal channel kind of becomes a little bit overbearing. The high treble channel is too bright and the normal channel is too dark. And you've got this deep, flubby bass, but also the shrill high. But what makes the amp so cool is you can sort of adjust that as needed to get a good tone out of it. So there you can hear just how much range there is available in both gain and voicing just by adjusting those two controls. And that same kind of idea, and granted it's based more on the JTM 45 sort of circuit, but for example, the Marshall Vintage Modern has a detail and a body control instead of just one universal gain control. And it's sort of the same idea, is that you're mixing this brightly voiced channel with this dark channel together to make the kind of sound that you want, as opposed to having just one singular channel already voiced kind of in the middle, basically. Now, there is something to be said for that single channel design. I mean, that's the way that most modern amps are configured. But there's certainly some tones available in a plexi or a JTM or the Vintage Modern that can't really be obtained by other amps because they're all cascading gain stage kind of designs, as opposed to mixing two channels in parallel. And that's really what makes this an amp that should be in any recording studio stable, because it offers such a unique tone. Now I'm going to pull this jumper out, and the last little bit to this video is I wanted to demonstrate also, because as it stands right there, I could end the video and that would just be what a plexi sounds like, but I also wanted to show off what is one of the most popular mods for this amp. And a lot of that popularity stems from 70s era rock. But the one wire mod, which will engage when I pull out this volume control, all it's doing is I'm cascading the normal channel into the high treble channel, so V1A into V1B, then into the shared gain stage V2A, and then so on, tone stack and PI. Because of that cascading gain, there's a lot more gain. And I was really, when I first did this mod, I was really surprised at just how much gain I was able to get out of what's a relatively clean mid-gain kind of old school amp design. I'm gonna set both channels just right in the middle at 5, and I'm gonna pull this out. So right now, the channel, the input 1 is skipping the normal gain. So it's kind of like the low input on a 2204 or 2203, right? Where you're skipping the first gain stage if I plug into 1 here. And then all that is it's the high treble channel, totally unchanged, because you're just getting stages 2 and 3, which is 1 and 2 on the treble channel. So I still have that option. Sadly, you can't plug in like a Y cable or 2 cables and use a foot switch like an ABY to switch between. That would be really cool, because you'd be able to switch from the one wire high gain to the other one, but that doesn't work because it shorts across the 2 inputs and it just goes silent. So kind of a shame. Maybe a couple of tweaks to the circuit, you could probably turn that into an actual foot switchable feature. So let me, I pulled that out. Let's make sure my volume doesn't blow the room out. So you can already hear it's got a lot more gain and a lot more aggression than the stock plexi circuit would have. So let me roll. Now the way that this works is, since the first gain stage is the normal channel, the normal input kind of behaves like your global gain control. So as I roll that up, the gain is going to get louder and more aggressive. And if I roll up the high treble control, then that second gain stage is going to let more gain through to the third gain stage and then the power amp. So if I roll up both controls all the way to 10, it gets very loose, kind of flubby. It's not the most pleasing sound, but I'm just going to start off with that. And then what I'll do is I'll roll the high treble volume down and kind of cut some of the the volume, but especially cut some of the bass going through the second gain stage, which is going to clean it up a little bit and make it sound more like what you would expect from like a high gain Marshall sound. So yeah, that's pretty mean sounding, especially for an amp that is as old in design as this one. One other thing I wanted to cover just before this is over is I'm going to go on to the I'm going to turn that one wire mod off, and I'm going to go on to the high treble channel with the gain maxed out, and I'm just going to kind of show what some different pedals can do through this as a platform. So that's the clean amp by itself. I'm going to kick on the Boss ST1 here. Alright, so that's the Boss ST1. As you can see, that adds a lot more, both volume, gain, and some treble. So it's definitely a lot more aggressive, boosted by a pedal like that, and even more so on the bright channel that we're already on. Now, one other trick you can do is plug into the normal channel and then boost with a very bright pedal like the Boss SD1 or an Ibanez Tube Screamer, maybe with the tone control a little bit higher than noon, and you can sort of add some bite to the tone, which is really cool because you can have this nice mellow, clean rhythm tone, and then kick it up with some extra treble and brightness to cut through the mix. Now, still on the high treble channel, I'm going to engage the full tone OCD. Is a pretty good pedal for this style of transparent amp. Now, that is a pedal I've had a love-hate relationship with for a while. Sometimes I think it sounds amazing. Through other amps, I think it sounds like trash. But this amp, I think it sounds pretty good. And I'm probably going to squeal a little bit because I'm sitting so close, but I'll try not to. I'll try to cut that out of the video. So the full tone OCD adds more gain than the SD1 and more bass and treble, so that can pretty much be a replacement for a drive mode on an amp. Granted, I'm running the loudness at full on the high treble channel here, but if I rolled that back, say to like half, I could have kind of a low gain, almost clean, maybe manipulate the volume knob on my guitar to get like a true clean sound. Kick on the OCD and you've got this immediate, instant, hard rock, heavy hitting kind of sound. And then the last pedal I think I'll show off is the Proco Rat, just because it's thick and full and sludgy, and it's really perfect in a bright channel like this. Okay, and then last little segment, because obviously it's hard to talk about this amp without talking about some of its famous users, Eddie Van Halen being one of them, and not that I'm going to try to play anything too crazy that he can play, obviously, but I am going to show, so I'm on the high treble channel. His amps, there's a lot of rumors about how he got his tone, variac starving some of the voltage. So if a 12AX7 preamp tube, for example, if it's running at lower voltage, it's actually more distorted. If you ever have, I once had an amp that had a short that caused the V1 12AX7 to run at like 400 volts or something, which is like 150 volts over spec. And suddenly the amp got crazy clean when previously it was pretty distorted. So that's a cool fact for you. So the variac and, you know, some trickery with mods and space echo and, you know, who knows exactly how he got his sound. But either way, one thing that you can't argue is that the plexi amp was at the core of that tone. So let me, I'll try to show off a little bit. I've added a short slapback delay, which is kind of supposed to work like an echo plex. It's got a little bit of drive on it too, but it doesn't drive the initial input, and it's in front of the amp. Only the first repeat gets that drive. Nothing is in the effects loop with this amp right now. And then I have a phaser pedal as well. Let's try the full tone OCD for that sound. All right, so there you go. Really, really cool amp, capable of a lot of different tones. Sounds amazing, and I guess the only thing I kind of forgot to mention was what speakers I'm playing through. In this case, I'm using 1986 Marshall JCM 800 cab with 1986, of course, Celestion G12 T75s, which are a little bit more like the G1265 speaker. They're kind of, the treble sort of chopped off and they've got a lot of mid-range. Not really like the modern iteration of the G12 T75, which is a more, a scooped, a little more flat kind of sound. So they're really great speakers and killer for this kind of vintage Marshall, you know, hard rock tone. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it, and have a good one. Bye. I think I blew my ears out at the end there. A little too loud.